Hey there, everyone. Today I'd like to talk about Richard Rorty's 1993 paper, Putnam and the Relativist Menace. In this paper, Rorty basically has a scholarly back and forth with his neo-pragmatist brother, Hilary Putnam, and he talks about some of the disagreements and agreements they have. And in particular, he wants to fight against the notion that Rorty himself is a relativist. Rorty, in line with people like Dewey and Donald Davidson, is going to suggest that in fact he is not a relativist. And if we want to understand why he's not, first we need to have a fuller grasp of what it means to be a relativist. Now, a relativist is trying to think about how can we come to know the world when all of that knowledge is filtered through senses and perturbed by one's subjectivity, by the fact that one is an individual with a particular perspective upon the world. So the relativist says this is going to lead to a fragmented and perspectival understanding of the world where I have one perspective on the world and another subject will have another perspective on the world, and we're all looking at the same world. And the world is present. And what we do in order to know it is we represent it or we represent it. When we represent the world, what happens is the world comes to us as stimuli, right? Think about light and sound and all sorts of different empirical stimuli that come to us. These possess a number of primary qualities, and per the Lockean view, they gain a number of secondary qualities, things like color, which, for example, were not intrinsic to the stimuli, but rather were things that our brain imposed upon those stimuli. And we create a representation in our heads which yields knowledge of the world. This is a very modernist understanding of epistemology, coming all the way from Descartes, going into Locke and Berkeley and Kant. And all of these relativist understandings of epistemology can essentially be seen as Kantian, insofar as they maintain the idea that there is still something called the Ding an sich, or the thing in itself. And this is the world before it is perturbed by our senses. This is the world which is merely present and has yet to be represented or represented. This world is constituted of things in themselves, and it is unitary. And the reason that we disagree, so the relativist would say, is that we all have a relative and partial understanding of this one common objective world. And the reason that we disagree is because our subjectivity creates alternate perspectives or understanding of truth. Now, this is going to run very deep into creating a number of problems, such as, for example, how do we get different cultures to talk to each other? A relativist, and this was very popular in sociology as well as different theories of anthropology and philosophy, that different cultures have different ways of understanding things like gender or different social practices or how to interface with the environment. And one culture cannot come in and step in paternalistically and ask that the other culture change their ways. Because, well, what right do they have? They don't have an objective understanding of the world. They have a subjective and relative understanding of the world, just like the other culture. So the relativist will say that, for example, someone who believes in, freedom of religion or freedom of the press cannot go to a place where these freedoms are not recognized and say that this culture has a right to change it, because you would have to have some objective justification for how you can impose your perspective on another. This is going to lead to a stultification in epistemology which Richard Rorty is really wary of. Because Rorty is Deweyan through and through. He is a student of John Dewey philosophically. He didn't study under him, but he sees Dewey as kind of this height of what philosophy could be, which is a sort of experimental tinkering with concepts that is divorced from metaphysics or epistemology in the classical sense and moves toward cultural criticism as Rorty sees it. But Rorty maintains that this perspective that he's going to have, which is the neo-pragmatist perspective, is not a relativist one. And the reason he says this is because of a distinction being made by Quine and by Donald Davidson, which is a rejection of the scheme-content distinction. This is very similar to their rejection, along with Dewey and others, of the subject-object distinction, which is also present as a rejection in Heidegger. Now, the scheme-content distinction is very similar to what I've been saying about the Ding an sich, that there is a thing in itself which is the content of the world, and the way we come to have different perspectives or understandings or claims about this is that we use different conceptual schemes in order to talk about it. This could be different languages, different scientific theories, different cultural matrices, whatever it may be. These are different conceptual schemes which have an internal logic of their own, where elements within it operate in certain set manners due to the way that the schema is set up. Now, if one views all these schemas as looking at one common world, then we would in fact be a relativist. But Donald Davidson, especially, is very wary of this because he says, well, how can we say that there is some objective world unperturbed by our conceptual schemes? And Putnam, at the very beginning of this essay, quoted by Rorty, actually follows up and agrees with this, saying, elements of what we call language or mind penetrate so deeply into what we call reality that the very project of representing ourselves as being mappers of something language independent is totally compromised from the start. Like relativism, but in a different way, realism is an impossible attempt to view the world from nowhere, with a capital N. As such, we cannot distinguish the schemes we use from the knowledge of the content of the world that we gain. And as such, we must divorce ourselves from this notion of a Ding an sich. This is seen by most of these neo-pragmatists as merely a Kantian remnant, where we wanted to maintain this notion that there is a Ding an sich, but even for Kant, he can't really talk about this. He maintains that, well, there are certain limits to reason, and beyond these limits, famously laid out in Kant's Antinomies, things like, for example, was there a first cause, right? Or did the universe have a beginning? Things like these are questions that we cannot answer because there can be perfectly valid answers for and against both positions, and this is because we've reached a limit of reason, one of reason's antinomies. In the same way, Kant approaches the Ding an sich and says, well, I can't actually really tell you about this. Now, I can tell you some sort of structures of the mind for how one can possibly represent the world, but I can't tell you about the world independent of those representations. I can give you structures for the way that we represent the world, but not the world independent of those structures. Now, the neo-pragmatists see this and say, well, then let's stop talking about the Ding an sich. Let's stop berating and making our knowledge claims small by pretending like they're merely relative claims regarding some objective world. If we can't even coherently talk about or posit this objective world, the Ding an sich, then let's get rid of this scheme, content, subject-object dualism. As such, they want to start talking about, okay, Well, how can we talk about translating between different cultures? Because this has been one of the problems, is how do you talk between cultures where they disagree so much on fundamental principles that it would seem impossible to do so? And you might want to check out my Donald Davidson lecture for context on this one and on some answering of that question. But Rorty's solution is one that he once again quotes from Putnam. These are all in Realism with the Human Face, where Putnam says, "It can be objective that an interpretation or an explanation is the correct one, given the interests which are relevant in the context." What this is saying is that if we know the goals, the interests, and the values that a certain culture has, we can give objective statements about whether or not their solutions, their actions, will actually go towards fulfilling those goals. So we do have some sense in which we can talk about the warrant of, for example, one culture coming and telling another culture that they need to change. Because they can, for example, appeal to their shared values. And they can say that on the grounds of these values, you are not acting in accordance with them, and your society would be better if you changed them. Now, of course, you can't make the other culture change, but you can try to convince them by appealing to these common given interests. And you can never get beyond the given of interests and values and norms. This is something that Rorty thinks is the reason philosophy should move into more cultural criticism instead of metaphysics or epistemology, classically conceived. As such, he says that I have urged that we continue to speak with the vulgar while offering a different philosophical gloss on this speech than that offered by the realist tradition. I've written at tedious length against the idea that philosophy has been a pedestal on which our culture rested. Rorty thinks that, in fact, philosophy and all of these theoretical schemas come secondarily to our practical experience in the world. The pragmatic, the fact that things have a use relative to goals and norms which are given, which we already have. This is the reason that we need to get rid of, as he says, the idea of the quote-unquote view from nowhere, the idea of a sort of knowing that has nothing to do with agency, values, or interests. And as such, he wants to start dispelling with some problems, which he says we shouldn't call these pseudo-problems. This would be, for example, the problem of other minds, or the external world, or objective or subjective knowledge. He says that we should view these antiquated problems as problematics. And this is a term that Deleuze uses as well. He says, I should not have spoken of unreal or confused philosophical distinctions, but rather of distinctions whose employment has proved to lead nowhere, proved to be more trouble than they were worth. For pragmatists like Putnam and I, the question should always be, what use is it, rather than is it real or is it confused? Criticism of other philosophers as distinctions in problematics should charge relative inutility rather than meaninglessness or illusion or incoherence. As such, we are trying to give a descriptive picture of how we can live forward. This is something that Dewey stresses, is that philosophy is a microcosm of human life. And human life is one of tarrying, surviving, and attempting to thrive by living forward into the future. We throw ourselves ahead of ourselves, as Heidegger would say. As such, we need to talk about what it means to be humans in a way that more productively leads to this. And taking from Dewey once again, Rorty thinks that we should accept a Darwinian perspective in which we are little more than more complicated animals. Rorty says that according to this story, these organisms, organs, and abilities, and the practices they made possible have a lot to do with who we are and what we want. But they no more put us in a representational relation to an intrinsic nature of things than do the anteater's snout or the bowerbird's skill at weaving. I see Dewey as having used this story to start freeing us from representationalist notions. And I see Putnam and Donald Davidson as continuing this Deweyan initiative. I regard Putnam's continuing insistence on using the term representation as a mistake. Instead, I follow Davidson in thinking that it is good to be rid of representations, and with them the correspondence theory of truth. For it is thinking that there are representations which engenders thoughts of relativism. And this returns us back to what I was saying at the beginning, which is why Rorty does not see himself as a relativist, because we are not talking about some common world which we represent. Instead, we're talking about something which we tarry with, and this we, whether it be an individual that's being spoken of or a small group, cannot be separated from its environment. This is something that, for example, evolutionary theory has proven time and time again. To talk about the individual is to talk both about this biological thing and this social thing and this existential thing. But on the biological point, we know that our genetic information, in order to reify itself in the world, requires that certain environmental conditions are met such that that genetic expression can occur. Our genes will turn on and off depending upon the ability of the environment to suit the expression of those traits. As such, many people, for example, may have certain latent conditions that will come about when they move to a new location or when generations go by getting adapted to a new environment. Therefore, we cannot talk about the individual qua individual, but rather the individual as a microcosm and participant in this common world. Therefore, there is no separation of the scheme and content or the subject from the Ding an sich, which is the objective world. Instead, we must see ourselves not as corresponding to some theory of truth, but rather usefully tarrying with the world. Rorty says, rather, I am suggesting in the spirit of Deweyan experimentalism that it behooves us to give the self-image Darwin suggested to us a try, in the hope of having fewer philosophical problems on our minds. And this is very similar to what William James and also Peirce in particular says when Peirce mentions in How to Make Our Ideas Clear that doubt is a state of discord within the mind which compels us to investigate the world. It compels us to be skeptical towards things which we hadn't been skeptical before toward. By doing this, we have the possibility of resolving doubt into a belief, where a belief is an unperturbed state of mind. It is almost more uncritical, and the more live state of mind is one of doubt. Therefore, this tarrying with the world is a constant attempt to resolve doubt into belief, which is stable. And Rorty thinks that if we want to have a productive way of living with the world, we have to get rid of philosophy as a divorced concept from the world, which is a sort of canonized theoretical scheme. He says that we should see what happens if, in Jean-Paul Sartre's words, we attempt to draw the full conclusions from a consistently atheist position, a position in which such phrases as the nature of human life no longer distract us from the absence of a God's eye point of view. The first step in conducting this experiment should be to set aside the shards of the subject-object, scheme-content, and reality-appearance distinctions, and to think of our relation to the rest of the universe in purely causal, as opposed to representationalist terms, the same way in which we think of the anteaters and the bowerbirds' relation to the rest of the universe. And this is something that Graham Harman, for example, points out in his object-oriented ontology, is that a lot of ontologies have privileged the human perspective when it comes to discerning truth, viewing human phenomena as effectively counting for 50% of our ontology and everything else as the other 50%. But if we take this Darwinian perspective and all of its implications, we realize that our perspective on the world and our integrated action in the world is action in common with the world of the anteater and the bowerbird, albeit often at a distance and one that we don't recognize, and that as such, our perspective has no justification for being objectively and a priori better than these other perspectives. Now, we can use, for example, various faculties that we have developed through evolutionary history to our advantage, but so can other organisms, right? Certain organisms have greater speed, or maybe they have greater reproductive yields, all of these different things. Now, Rorty has some very interesting things when it comes to talking about culture and talking about better or worse outcomes, actions, values, decisions, etc. for a particular culture. He says that his position is, quote, explicitly ethnocentric. Now, that may strike one as surprising, and I think it would behoove us to look at a definition of ethnicity, which, of course, is where the term ethnocentric is coming from. Ethnicity is the quality or fact of belonging to a population, group, or subgroup made up of people who share a common descent or cultural background. Now, if we think about common descent in the Darwinian sense, we have a fuller environmental picture of what it means to be this or that group, this or that culture. Namely, it is to be part of a background, which is the world, which we are integrated with, which we do not transcend above, and that as such, we are constantly tarrying with and negotiating that environment. This means that our reforms in our standards of warranted assertability, he says, are not better by reference to a previously known standard, but just better in the sense that they come to seem clearly better than their predecessors. In other words, if I am less or more warranted to say a certain statement, such as, for example, racism is bad, we must ask, for whom is it bad, and from whom are we getting this statement? From whom are we getting the statement that it is or is not warranted, ... And when we're talking about standards of warranted assertability, we necessarily speak from what Rorty will call an ethnocentric position, which is to say we take certain cultural notions of what we value and use that to determine if something is warranted. He says, Putnam sees me as relativistic because I can appeal to no matter of fact to adjudicate between the possible world in which the Nazis won, inhabited by people for whom the Nazis' racism seems common sense, and our egalitarian tolerance crazy, and the world in which we won and the Nazis' racism seems crazy. I cannot, indeed, appeal to such a fact of the matter any more than a species of animal that is in danger of losing its ecological niche to another species and thus faces extinction can find a fact of the matter to settle the question of which species has the right to the niche in question. But neither, as far as I can see, can Putnam. This is his important point here, that we cannot have some God's eye perspective on what is going to be good, because to say something is good, we must ask good for whom and from whose perspective. And this perspective is not divorced from a world in which our values are evolving through time. As such, Rorty recognizes that while he does not like the Nazis' racism, there is a conceivable world in which they did win, and our culture would be irrevocably affected by this, such that it would seem warranted to, for example, be a racist, where egalitarian tolerance would seem crazy. And Putnam is going to talk about truth as idealized rational acceptability in order to try to get out of this, to try to have some matter of fact that it is bad to, for example, be a racist, full stop. That we can say that objectively and we can argue with the Nazis that they are wrong. Now, Putnam says, I cannot see what idealized rational acceptability can mean except acceptability to an ideal community. Nor can I see how, given that no such community is going to have a God's eye view, which is to say a perfectly objective view, this ideal community can be anything more than us as we should like to be. Nor can I see what us can mean here except us educated, sophisticated, tolerant, wet liberals. The people who are always willing to hear the other side, to think out all the implications, etc. AKA the sort of people who both Putnam and I hope at our best to be. Identifying idealized rational acceptability with acceptability to us at our best is just what I had in mind when I said that pragmatists should be ethnocentrists rather than relativists. What he's saying is that I do not say that when something is better or worse that I am saying it relative to a perspective. Instead, I am immersed in a way of living in which I take certain facts of, for example, valuing the autonomy of others or the free discourse of ideas. I merely take these ideas for granted, and I cannot give an objective justification to why other cultures ought to have these, because I don't have a God's eye point of view on this would be better for all times and places. This is similar to a very common misrepresentation of Darwinism that sees evolution as teleological, which is to say, moving towards some definite end. You may have seen the common graphic of the primitive ape slowly rising through generations to its 2 legs and becoming a human. This sees evolution as having a goal, and that there is some God's eye perspective of what is better. But this notion of better, of, for example, what is more adaptable or more suitable, depends upon the environment. A cactus is going to be adapted very well for a desert environment, but very poor for the Amazon rainforest. And we can't objectively say that the cactus is better without talking about an environment for which it is better. In the same way, we cannot talk about rationality or acceptability or warrant outside of some appeal to us, which is not a relative us, it's the only us we know. Now, contrary to Peirce, who is saying that over time our disagreements will start to merge towards some point of agreement, which is truth with a capital T, or this notion of reality with a capital R. Instead, Rorty thinks that we should abandon this, and we should not see our process of tarrying as moving towards some final goal. Rather, we are just indefinitely extending a process in which Rorty says, if there is no such guidance system built into human beings qua human, then the terms warranted, rationally acceptable, etc. will always invite the question, to whom? This question will always lead us back, it seems to me, to the answer, us, at our best. So all a fact of the matter about whether P is a warranted assertion can mean is a fact of the matter about our ability to feel solidarity with a community that views P as warranted. And Rorty insists that this is not a relativistic position, because we cannot talk about things like knowledge or use or truth or fact or value outside of some pre-given ethnocentric position, as he puts it. This us that we must merely take for granted when we talk about truth or knowledge or value. But, he says, truth neither comes nor goes. That is not because it is an entity that enjoys an atemporal existence, but because it is not an entity at all. The word truth, in this context, is just the reification of an appropriative and indefinable adjective. In other words, it's something ephemeral, which we just take for granted. And when we talk about us, and we talk about this hypothetical better version of us is merely language users whom we can recognize as better versions of ourselves. And these better versions of ourselves is not an idealized notion that we pulled out of our asses. Instead, it's those whom we recognize as people who have come to hold different beliefs from ours by a process that we, by our present notions of the difference between rational persuasion and force, count as rational persuasion. In other words, we share something in common with this group such that we can recognize their activity as rational, and they can use that rationality to persuade us forcibly, in the sense of, intellectual force, that we are not acting in accordance with our values or beliefs. As such, Rorty says, if we did not build this process into the picture, we should not call the result a version of ourselves, but something like an unfortunate replacement for ourselves. If we want to talk about a version of ourselves in the future, it requires that this notion that we have of who we are is something malleable, that's subject to change. He says, why should either I or this patsy called the relativist explicate quote-unquote bad in terms of metaphysical pictures? This is a response to those thinkers who would say that to talk about better or worse solutions is to claim some God's eye point of view, which says metaphysical truths about what is good or bad. Instead, Rorty says that there are all sorts of occasions on which we say that our concept of X needs to be changed and old intuitions thrown overboard, not for metaphysical reasons, but for reasons that are called, depending on context, ethical or practical or political, and I might add, or pragmatic. In other words, most of the time we talk about our decisions and we disagree on ethical or practical or political or familial or religious grounds, right? We don't do this on the metaphysical grounds of let's get in a theoretical schema. Rorty maintains that what is going to allow us to grow, what pries us out of present convenience, as he puts it, is just the hope of greater convenience in the future. Convenience in this context means something like ability to avoid fruitless, irresolvable disagreements on dead-end issues. And that as such, we should move everything over from epistemology and metaphysics to cultural politics. From claims to knowledge and appeals to self-evidence to suggestions about what we should try. And trying is the key. We are going to tinker, and we're going to do it in a way, for example, where we realize that in order for cultures to talk to each other, it requires that there's some sort of affinity for each other and that we create that affinity and we try to operate on some common terms. As such, Rorty thinks that this is a project that is going to move philosophy into a productive realm where instead of talking about the matrix or the trolley problem or AI in the abstract, we start talking about these in any way that they can have concrete practical effects. And as Peirce would say, insofar as they may have practical bearing, we make that practical bearing the sole content of that object. That being said, I hope that this has been somewhat helpful at explicating what Rorty has to say. He's a very interesting thinker. Check out any of my other lectures that I've done on pragmatism, as well as postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.